Very closely with me here on Law and Crime. Anita, what I'm struggling with is how does this 2003 case relate to the present day case that we're involved with, especially since Robert Durst was acquitted of that murder?
It really doesn't, Derek, but this is a tough case for the prosecution. They got to go back, to the early 80s. We've been talking about Kathy Durst for weeks now, even though this is a case involving Susan Berman and her murder 20 years ago. Morris Black, I don't really think advances the ball that much for the prosecution, especially because obviously Durst was acquitted of the most serious murder charges based on a self-defense theory. That's what makes this case so difficult. He has the same legal defense team, and where obviously different prosecutors, different state, but in a murder where Durst admitted to killing Morris Black, chopping up the body, throwing it in the Gulf of Mexico, and he walked away more or less a free man. I think the state's going to have its hands full in this particular case here in California.
So do you think that's a foreshadowing of what's to come in this trial? The fact that Robert Durst was able to walk away from a murder charge?
There, you can never know what 12 jurors are going to do. And I think even Durst himself was surprised at that not guilty verdict out there in Houston, based on that Galveston murder. But this is a tough case. And I think Durst has a very good defense team. I credit the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for bringing it because I think it's a righteous case. And I think there's certainly enough evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. But unlike many of the other trials we've covered together here on Law and Crime, this one won't be as easy for the prosecution.
Right. And the fact that we've heard from Durst, at least in this previous court case, the testimony that he made, do you think he'll repeat that in this case, actually take the stand and testify in his own defense?
I fully expect Robert Durst to testify in this case. That's something that the defense attorneys have said during both openings, right? We had the opening in 2020 before the pandemic and the most recent opening just a couple months ago. That's something defense attorneys have said. He did it in the Morris Black case. He gave a very extensive interview with John Lewin, the district attorney, when he was arrested several years ago. So there's no doubt in my mind that Robert Durst will be taking the stand, and it's going to be an explosive testimony when he does.
Right. Well, in a portion of that testimony, Robert Durst was asked about what happened to his first wife, Kathleen, which is a source of great debate. She went missing some 40 years ago and really has never argued against that Durst has nothing to do with getting rid of people who may or may not know literally where the bodies are buried. But the prosecutor's putting on at least a circumstantial case surrounding it, right?
Very circumstantial case, but fortunately for John Lewin, he got a very favorable judge, and pretty much everything goes. I mean, we're hearing about Kathy Durst. That makes sense because obviously that's the motive for the Susan Berman murder. We're hearing about Morris Black, even though that case was tried and resulted in acquittal. But we're going to be watching parts of the Jinx, which is a documentary, maybe it's a work of fiction. We're probably going to be seeing parts of All Good Things, which is a fictional movie. So, anything goes in this case, and it's really important for the prosecution because they need every single piece of this puzzle. Because let's not forget, there's not a lot of direct physical evidence in this case. Really, we have some admissions during the Jinx. We have a cadaver note. But that's it. Otherwise, it's a really circumstantial case. So they're going to need all this evidence to dirty up Bob Durst so these 12 jurors think that he's a murderer, he's killed 3 people, and he's capable of doing it again.
And investigative journalist Pat LaLama, who's been inside the court for the Durst trial as it's been continuing, this line of testimony here from Durst, the recorded testimony, seems to show a close relationship at first between Durst and Morris Black, but then a bit of paranoia on the part of Robert Durst in terms of the key to his apartment, taking it back, worried about him coming in and maybe having other keys to his home. What do you make of this, Neama Rahmani?
Well, very fascinating testimony. Let's not forget that Robert Durst was dressed as a woman during this entire time when he was hiding out there in that 1-bedroom apartment in Galveston. And he develops this relationship with his neighbor. They exchange keys, and ultimately the neighbor figures out that no, it's not a woman, and it's the infamous, Robert Durst, who everyone suspects of, causing his wife to disappear and murdering her. So it's really sort of fascinating testimony. And again, It's just time after time, whether it's a documentary, whether it's with a district attorney, or whether it's an open court, Durst will talk and will try to talk his way out of these really sort of terrible situations. And I can't wait to see him do it again in this case.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence here, but it's pointing, at least according to the prosecutors, of a pattern in the behavior of Robert Durst, right?
Absolutely, Derek, and I 100% agree with Pat. Let's not also forget that Durst is in court looking frail with his catheter, with the urine. The state needs to show that this is a cold-blooded killer. He may look the way he does, but this is Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. So they really need to dirty him up, because the jurors are going to feel sympathetic for this old man who's there, who clearly has significant health problems, who's deteriorating, who's in a wheelchair. So, a lot of this past, evidence and testimony from things that happened decades ago is still relevant. So these jurors don't feel overly sympathetic for someone who, at least allegedly, is a triple murderer.
The fact that we haven't found the head, the skull in the Morris Black case, what do you make of that?
It's not good for Bob Durst. He dismembers Morris Black. He mops up the blood. The pieces are thrown into the Gulf of Mexico, where a young boy was fishing and found it with his mother. So not a good look for Bob Durst. Similarly, a lot of the other evidence that the state is bringing in, the fact that he's a shoplifter, that he's rich, but he's applying for food stamps. These are all things that the jury is not going to like. So even though he was acquitted, I agree with Pat here. These are all key pieces of evidence that are going to show that Bob Durst is, at least allegedly, a sociopath who doesn't care about other people. And he's certainly capable of walking into his best friend's house off Benedict Canyon and shooting her in the back of the head as she's cleaning up some dog poop.
Journalist who's been inside the courtroom for the Durst trial, and former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Neama, the fact that this testimony brings up the fact that Morris Black had a heart condition, that doesn't really have any bearing, though, on how he was murdered, right? I mean, we know he was shot.
Aaron is one of the best, Chip Lewis. I mean, he really has an all-star defense team, Bob Durst, who have been used to defending him in these types of cases. But I don't see how that particular line of questioning does a whole lot to advance the ball, the defense theories of this case. Again, they do want to show that the victims here are unhinged. We know that they're going after Kathy Durst for allegedly being a drug addict, for Susan Berman extorting her best friend. So I'm sure they want to dirty up Morris Black a bit as well, so he doesn't have the sympathy that the other victims have.
Be stricken in other kinds of cases, right? We're hearing a lot of hearsay testimony and testimony that may not exactly be completely relevant, but the judge is allowing it, right, Neama?
Anything goes in this courtroom. Any type of evidence comes in, regardless of whether it's fiction, nonfiction, relevant, not, speaking objections, attorneys arguing with each other, pointing the finger in front of the jury. I mean, Pat has that bird's eye view there just a few feet away, but it's really something that you don't typically see. I love Judge Wynne, but I really wish he would get a little better control of these attorneys and this courtroom, because it's turning into a mini circus out there here in downtown LA.
Words by Robert Durst caught on tape here shows that something was on his mind, something sinister.
Well, certainly John Lewin thought it was important enough. Let's not forget, the day before this final episode of the Jinx airs, with this confession or admission or whatever you want to call it, that's the day Durst is arrested, as he's apparently trying to flee. So again, at least the state thinks it's important. I agree with Pat on the rule of completeness. The defense should be able to play the whole unedited recording. Apparently, we're going to watch the whole Jinx. I don't know if that's going to happen. It's going to be fascinating if true. So we're going to see this entire documentary. But the defense has already come out to say that this is edited. This is not authentic. Apparently, they may argue that he was under the influence and methamphetamine, apparently, when he said this. So it's going to be interesting to see how the defense comes after it. Because, again, at least from the state's perspective, this and the cadaver note, that's the kind of smoking gun that they're hanging their hat on in this case.
Right. I mean, to be a fly on the wall of that bathroom, though, Neama Rahmani, right? I mean, to know what was really going on in between the edited comments.
No question, this hot mic, and again, it makes for good TV. And this is where TV in Hollywood and courtroom, I mean, it's all intersecting
Yeah,
it. You don't typically see this. I've been doing this for a
yeah.
long time. I've
Right.
prosecuted a lot of cases. I mean, it's really Hollywood meets the courtroom. It's really fascinating and
Got it.
unprecedented, frankly.
Absolutely. Neama, so this forensic pathologist going over some of the technical aspects of the autopsy that was performed, but it's pretty clear that the skull was compromised on Dylan, that there were marks on his head, on his skull, and apparently after death.
Yes, this is an important testimony for the state of Colorado here. The manner of death, the fact that Dylan's remains were found 10 miles from the Redwine home, the fact that the body was dismembered and the skull was found 5 miles away, the fact that there were no marks, at least nothing we've heard so far, that are consistent with an animal attack. Let's not forget that is the defense theory in this case, that Dylan wandered off and was attacked by animals in this very rural part of Colorado. So I think this is important evidence for the jurors to hear, to show, at least circumstantially, that the body parts and the bones, they're consistent with a murder, the blunt force trauma, the knife marks, and not consistent with an animal attack.
Right, and the father in this case, Mark Redwine, has denied any wrongdoing here, but all points are leading to something happening in his home. Right, we've got forensic evidence, blood found in his home and in his pickup truck as well. That's pretty hard evidence to get around, right?
Yeah, blood in the home, not a significant amount, but certainly his son's blood, who didn't live there and didn't visit regularly. There's blood in the pickup truck. And let's not forget the cadaver dog also alerted to the pickup truck. So again, not someplace you would typically see blood, not someplace that a cadaver dog would typically alert to.
Right.
So that's all powerful evidence for these jurors to hear.
This bit of testimony that we just saw really goes to your previous point that the injuries Dylan Redwine sustained not consistent with an animal attack.
Yeah, one of the things about being a good prosecutor is anticipating your opponent's defense. And in this case, we know what it is. The defense has and will argue that Dylan wandered off and he was attacked. So you want to get out ahead of any potential defense argument and to show that no. The injuries that he suffered, those cut marks, they're not bite marks. They didn't come from an animal. They came from a tool. They came from a human. And it's not possible that he was attacked by animals.
And do you think, though, that the prosecution has done a good job laying out a motive here? I mean, we know there was talk of pictures, compromising pictures on the computer that Dylan saw of his dad dressed as a woman and committing a disgusting act. But is that a motive here? Is that enough to kill?
Well, that's the question the jurors are going to ask. What would prompt a father to kill his own son? I mean, it's such a horrific crime. But the prosecution has done, I think, a good job of establishing the three elements they want in every murder case, right? The means, we know he had access, the opportunity. Certainly, Dylan was alone with his father. There was no one else present and really no one around for miles at this particular home. And that motive, what would cause someone to get so upset at his son to actually kill him and dismember his body, this young son? So that's when we saw the videos that show really a really strange relationship between father and son. We heard testimony from mom and stepfather that say that this really wasn't a good father. This wasn't someone who loved his son. Again, this is at least the state's argument here. So he had no reason to protect his son like we would expect a father to do. In fact, this is someone who wanted to do away with his son when he found those very compromising and embarrassing photos on his computer.
Of course, Mark Redwine denies any involvement in his son's murder. He's testified or has said that, I lost my best friend. Pretty powerful testimony. Hard to imagine how the defense would get around it.
A very powerful testimony for the prosecution, and you know it because the defense spent most of court on Tuesday going after this testimony and attacking it. We spent a lot of time during what we call voir dire of this expert, where she was laying the foundation for her expertise, as well as her dog, Molly. And we all love dogs, and jurors especially love dogs, and they love to hear about these narcotic sniffing dogs, money smelling dogs, and in this particular case, the cadaver smelling dogs. And what Molly did, this particular dog, to alert to the scent of a cadaver, both in Redwine's home and more importantly, in the trunk of his vehicle, and not someplace where you would typically expect a dog to alert to a dead body unless one was transported there.
So, Neama, this is the prosecution here on redirect, really trying to sort of solidify what this cadaver dog can and can't do.
Yeah, and again, Derek, we know the defense didn't like this testimony because there were more objections to this particular witness than all the other witnesses combined in this case so far, at least from my sense of it. And it was really fascinating because, again, there was no stipulation to her expertise. So she was able to talk about other cases completely unrelated to Dylan and Mark Redwine, where Molly had been involved and she had detected a cadaver. So on cross, after the foundation was laid and the court admitted her as an expert, the defense focused on two things. One, false alerts. Two, what the expert referred to as cueing, which is basically prompting or leading the dog to where the answer is. And I thought the state did a good job redirecting this particular witness to sort of rebut those two primary defense arguments of false alerts and cueing.
Neama, is this witness a reliable one? I mean, the defense would probably argue that, you know, she's a hired hand, that she has a bit of bias in favor of the prosecution. Do you get the sense that that's the case?
Well, from the defense's perspective, this is all junk science. You can't rely on dogs alerting to cadavers. They're saying this is months later where the dog was alerting. But again, the jurors, they're eating this up. This is the type of evidence that they expect. This is the CSI, Law and Order era, you know? And who doesn't like dogs? And who wouldn't love Molly, the cadaver dog? So again, I think this testimony went a long way for the prosecution and will be one of the reasons they're going to be able to get a guilty verdict in this case.
Right, and the judge seemed to be allowing and giving a lot of leeway in terms of the questioning here for the prosecution, right?
Yeah, this judge, and it's well established. You know, I'm a former federal prosecutor. I did primarily narcotics. We all know that dogs can detect the scent of narcotics. Happens all the time. You know, we had dogs when I was with the federal government that actually detected the smell of cash, believe it or not, money that was going south of the border. So, you know, there's certainly no question that there are dogs that can detect the smell of a dead body even weeks or months later.
I said this was fascinating because we're getting a glimpse as to Robert Durst dressed as a woman by the name of Miss Steiner, and apparently, according to that transcript, was a very convincing woman.
Derek, nothing surprises me in this case, and I have to address the law school students' involvement. I mean, how exciting. It's been 20 years or more since I was in law school, and to be involved in really one of the trials of the century, you know, spanning almost 40 years must be really cool for those law students. You know, turning to Morris Black and, you know, his neighbor, Miss Steiner, also known as Robert Durst, who was on the run or at least in hiding. I mean, what an interesting story there. You know, you kind of have your potentially nosy neighbor, Morris Black, who got involved with really the wrong person, and who he thinks is a female, you know, allegedly blind, who ends up murdering him and, you know, chopping up his body. So just a very, very fascinating case. Obviously, that trial happened years ago and resulted in acquittal, but it's really interesting to get little bits and pieces and the testimony here in our case, even though it's an unrelated murder.
And the bizarre aspects of this case is one thing, but what we're really trying to get to, at least for the prosecution sense, is establishing a pattern, right? A pattern of murder on the part of Robert Durst.
You have to establish a pattern because there's really not a lot of physical evidence here, and there's no question that Susan Berman and Robert Durst were best friends, and the defense has and will argue, why would someone kill their best friend? What reason would he have? I mean, the reason is obviously, at least according to the state, that she knew where the bodies were buried, literally, and Susan Berman was involved in the cover-up of the Kathy Durst murder, and she was extorting her good friend Robert Durst. But it's a very good defense argument. I think something that the jurors may latch on to. So the state, and John Lewin's one of the best, you know, cold case prosecutors, but they really got to sort of really paint this picture of someone who's not a frail man in his late 70s, but really a cold-blooded killer.
Case of Morris Black, the neighbor of Robert Durst, killed in Galveston, Texas back in 2003. Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, joining me here. So, Neama, the fact that there's more on this line of questioning involving a woman named Miss Steiner that was actually Robert Durst dressed as a woman, just adding to the bizarre facts of that Morris Black case, but again, trying to connect the dots to how this relates to, Susan Berman's murder.
Derek, bizarre is the right word. Everything about this case is bizarre. Nothing really surprises me. Look, a lot of people think that that jury in Texas got it wrong, that Robert Durst shouldn't have been acquitted. I mean, folks were surprised in the legal community. I think even Robert Durst himself was surprised when the verdict was read. I don't think anyone expected a full acquittal on the most serious murder count. So I think what John Lewin is skillfully trying to do here is not necessarily relitigate this case, but plant that seed in the juror's mind that, there was a miscarriage of justice done by a jury in another state, in another case, and don't do the same thing here. Don't let this man get away with his third murder.
I'm not sure the jurors, though, are following this questioning about renting an apartment, someone related to a Miss Steiner trying to get the landlord to rent an apartment. I mean, is the allegation here that Robert Durst is trying to get another apartment, maybe to try and hide some evidence or do something behind the scenes here of this Morris Black murder?
Derek, I think one of the challenges in this case is that John Lewin has been living with it for so long. I mean, so many years he spent on just this one case, and all the attorneys have. This isn't just one of, several files that are on his desk. He spent years, maybe over a decade, trying to prosecute Robert Durst for the murder of Susan Berman. So sometimes when you're a prosecutor, and there's different ways to handle each case, you're just going to bring everything in because it's just in your head. And we know for the jurors, this is going to be a challenging case because they're going to spend at least 5 months, now probably longer because of all the breaks we've had for Robert Durst's medical appointments. So we're looking at probably closer to 6 months of testimony, which is a very long time in any case, much less a murder case that spans decades and multiple bodies.
So does that kind of strategy help the defense, when the prosecution throws everything but the kitchen sink, in front of them? Does it help the defense in terms of being able to say, hey, this is too much here, you're throwing all this extra stuff in that really doesn't relate, you're trying to muddy the waters?
You can lose the jurors, no question, but this is such a challenging case for the district attorney's office. I think you have no choice. I mean, let's set aside Morris Black. You absolutely have to talk about Kathy Durst and spend a lot of time focusing on their abusive relationship and the fact that Durst killed her, Susan Berman was involved in the cover-up, and that's why she was shot. With respect to Morris Black, I understand why they're spending some time on the murder, which ultimately resulted in acquittal based on the self-defense theory. But if I were the prosecution, I would get in and out, move on, because I don't think this advances the ball as much as they think it does.
Before we let you go, some final thoughts on this case.
Final thoughts and quick thoughts. It's very rare to have a criminal defendant testify in a trial, and here we know it's going to happen. It's happened before. We have all this old testimony in the Jinx, direct interview with John Lewin, testimony in another murder trial. So there's just so much interesting testimony and previous statements from this defendant. You typically don't see that in murder cases.
Yeah, we're following it very closely here. All right, Neama.